So, hello everyone. My name is Ryan Thompson. Today we're going to be talking about the registry keys in hopefully a way that's approachable for people who may not be as familiar with the Windows Registry. And we're going to be focusing more specifically on registry keys that have been abused by attackers for defense evasion. So a little bit about me. Currently I work as a senior intrusion researcher at CrowdStrike. I also do some work for SANS on one of their forensics courses focused on Windows, Mac, Linux, and cloud and containers forensics. A little bit all over the place, 3608 class. So I do a little bit of teaching. In previous lives, I've taught the US military how to do network threat hunting, and I've done security consultant work for some Fortune 500 companies. In a way past life, it seems like decades ago, I used to actually be in procurement, so I've been a little bit all over the place. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to start by establishing a baseline. I want to bring everyone up to the level they need to be able to speak about registry keys intelligently. It's not necessarily a training class on registry keys. So you're not going to walk away from it being an expert, but we're going to be speaking the same language. We're then going to talk about how registry keys are used legitimately and how they're abused. Just at a high level, kind of give you some context for the data that we're looking at. We're then going to dive into actual registry keys themselves, looking first at artifact removal, and then moving on to how you can leverage those keys to impair defenses. So trip up the defender, even shut down some certain defenses. We'll summarize what we saw, and then we'll talk about some recommendations on how to make things better. Or, I guess in this case, how to monitor for these things. So, opening up with Windows Registry. What is the Windows Registry? For the longest time, for me, it was this black box that I knew not to touch unless I had an issue, and then I would Google it, and I would very carefully enter in a command, and I would send it, and then I would kind of squint, I'd restart my computer, and if it turned back on, that was a good thing. So that's where I was a while back, and I think that's where a lot of people are, even in the security field. I don't think there's a lot of people that are very comfortable with it, but at its core, it's just a place to store settings. That's all the registry is. Now, I'm going to oversimplify it, so you're going to have some Windows purists in here wanting to throw things at me. But at its core, if you close your eyes and you imagine opening up an Explorer window and creating a bunch of folders, directories nested in directories, and then inside those folders, you just put key value pairs. You know, dark mode, on or off. Maybe we say when the computer starts up, start these applications. It's really just a place to store settings. So, everyone in this room needs to kind of understand the language that I'm going to use and understand when I'm going to use it incorrectly and kind of navigate that. So let's take a look at some of the verbiage that we use. First of all, at the top level, we're going to talk more about this. HKey local machine, that's an example of a key. That's a top level folder or top level directory in the registry. Every folder underneath, which once again we'll dive into a little bit more, are going to be called subkeys. I will incorrectly call a subkey a key. Just know that's the formal definition. And then we're going to talk about some values inside those registry keys, and these are where your settings live. So that's just kind of to level set. Now the good news is everyone in this room has interacted with registry keys, probably indirectly. So, by the way, there's going to be a lot of screenshots, some of them even moving pictures, so to speak. And so if you want to move to the front, either now or if you change your mind, absolutely scoot up. I try to make this as big as possible, but some of the font is still pretty small. So we've all interacted with a registry key. This is a very direct interaction. You go into your settings, and you say, I want this to go from light mode to dark mode. There's a registry key that lives back there that says, system uses light theme. That'll be set to a 0 or a 1. That's a pretty obvious way that we interact with it. But anytime you install an application, anytime you open a document, there are registry changes being made. And so a lot of the time it's indirect, and we're interacting with that. We're going to very briefly touch on where these files live. We are not going to dwell on this. Please, if you want to take notes, you can, but this is not where we're going to focus a lot of our time. We're not going to get lost in the weeds. There's a few different places. It lives in your user directory under a folder called ntuser.dat, and it also lives under Windows System 32 config. Now, this is not where we're going to start talking about registry. We are not going to start by saying, hey, yeah, you got to open up the security file and you go here. We abstract that a little bit. We don't talk about the physical location. We instead talk about the logical location. And so once again, this looks very complicated. Don't worry, we're going to simplify it. We're going to actually get rid of the physical files. We're only going to focus on the logical names. Now this is still pretty complicated. You'll notice there's arrows going places that are getting cut off in this diagram a little bit, and that's okay. What this means is this current config is a subset of local machine. So really the same data resides there, it's just a pointer to a different place. That can get confusing as well. Let's simplify it again. We're only going to focus on 2 of these major segments or hives, and let's define them a little bit. We're going to be looking at HKey local machine and HKey current user. Local machine is, well, settings for your entire machine. It's not going to be dependent upon what users logged in, and you're going to need a local admin to make changes to these. On the other hand, we're going to look at some current user registry keys, and these can be modified by a standard user and only impact the active user that's actually logged in. So, that said, let's talk a little bit about registry keys and how they're normally interacted with and how adversaries are actually going in and modifying those for their own needs. I want to start off by saying there's no such thing as an evil registry key. These machines, our systems and our applications are looking for certain keys to make judgments about how an application interacts or how our operating system interacts. And for the most part, they're all pretty benign, right? They're just settings that are set either on or off. They're pointing to certain file locations. And what happens is these mechanisms are abused by adversaries, but at their core, they're all legitimate functions. A lot of stuff on this slide. Not going to go through all of them. I just want you to know that when a legitimate application interacts with the registry, it's using this advanced API 32 DLL, and it's sending these API calls. And that's how a legitimate application will interact. That's not to say a malicious application can't be written to use these same things, but all your legitimate use cases are going to use this API. Now, what I'm interested in, specifically for this talk, is how do I directly modify a specific registry key and registry value? And so we can use a few different things. I'm going to be using reg.exe. You'll see that as reg-add or reg-delete, and that's used from the command line. PowerShell can also be used, and then there's a GUI called reg-edit. It can either be used from the command line to say, reg-edit, I want to make the changes in this .reg file, or you can pop it up, and you're going to see a lot of screenshots that I open up from reg-edit. It could be modified with a GUI. So these are more interesting. I'm not going to say no legitimate applications modify the registry this way. I'm sure there's some that are poorly written that do it this way. But for the most part, you should keep an eye on these. And we'll talk about that in the recommendation section. So how do we know what's in the registry? First of all, I want to give a huge shout out to the forensics community. They do a ton of work doing investigations into the registry. Now, what I have here may be a little bit hard to read from the back. That's okay. What this is the forensics community is a lot of the time having to do dead box forensics. So they don't have access to a live machine. They can't go in and see what settings are set. They can't go see the history of things. They don't have access to those applications. So they need to know where that data lives, and a lot of the time it's in the registry. And so they do a ton of work, and it's super, super helpful. Another way you can do research and actually achieve what the forensics community is after is by manually navigating that structure. There's a ton of folders. I was going to try to figure out how many keys and subkeys I had on my system. I didn't spend a whole lot of time doing it. Just let's all agree that there's a ton. So I wouldn't want to go navigate these manually, but you can. That's absolutely a method. And sometimes you find a key and you wonder, I wonder what that does. And sometimes Microsoft documents it, and sometimes they don't. The last one, which I think is my personal favorite, is by doing some level of monitoring. So I have something like procmon running. I'm looking at the active registry keys, and I open up my brand new Windows 11, and I start filtering down what I'm monitoring, and I say, great, I think I'm only looking at the settings application, and I go and I flip a toggle, and I see what registry key changes. This is a really good way to do research. Having said that, I didn't use any of these. I'm pretty fortunate where I work for that I get a really good signal-to-noise ratio from real-world intrusions. And so all the data you're going to see from this presentation comes from our Overwatch team at CrowdStrike. They do threat hunting. And once they identify a intrusion, they hand it over to my team. We do post-mortem analysis. So we get a lot of commands that are run by actual adversaries, sometimes criminal groups, sometimes nation state. But we get a lot of really good data. And so it's pretty easy for me. I don't need to go look at potential attacks. I can just go look at what's actually being used in the wild. So that's what's really cool about this. Every registry key you've seen has been used in the wild by an adversary. Having said that, first of all, I want to say we don't have screenshots. We don't have the capability to go navigate our client systems. And if we did, we still wouldn't share it. All the screenshots you're going to see are from a VM and are been recreated. Just want to make sure we get that out of the way. Nobody thinks I'm sharing client data up here. And then the last piece is we're focusing on intent. We're not focused on if Falcon blocked it or if you can get past Windows Defender with this. My team specifically is focused on what are adversaries trying to do. Let's document that and let's kind of disperse that to the community at large. So intent is the focus here. So first and foremost, we're going to start by focusing on individual registry keys that impact artifacts, and more importantly, remove those artifacts. Very, very small kill chain-esque here. Just wanted to kind of set the stage for what we're looking at. An adversary gains access. They probably do a little bit of digging around, a little bit of discovery. And sometimes what will happen is they'll say, I'd really like to be able to move around a little bit more freely, maybe open up some form of persistence and be able to walk back in, kind of leave a door ajar in this environment. Maybe I want to interact with a home directory or pull things down and not impact a user that exists. As users, we may notice if things pop up in our documents folder. I don't know about you, I probably wouldn't notice if it dropped into my downloads folder. It's a mess, right? But if an attacker can open up a new one, that segments them a little bit from the users, and it's less likely they're going to be seen. Now, the problem is, users may still notice that additional user being created, that extra user floating around that wasn't there before. So that is where they make the registry key change. Let's take a look at that. Real quick caveat, there's going to be registry keys along the top here. I'm not going to read those out. That doesn't make for an interesting presentation. It's a lot of slashes. I'm going to mess it up. But at the end, I'll give you a link and it'll have references to all these. And then please feel free to reach out to me. I can send you the slides as well. So I'm going to focus on the activity that's happening here. There's a screenshot on the left-hand side. There's a user that I've created called Susan Storm. And every time I log in, Susan Storm's name there, I can click on that one and log in. Once I make that registry key change, I've added a value to the special accounts user list called Susan Storm. I've set it to 1. To be truthful, I don't know the intent behind this registry key, but what happens is it starts disappearing from your interfaces. So it doesn't just happen on the login screen, but all of a sudden you won't see that as an option. When you click your start menu, normally you can click on your user and you can see other users that you can log into. You can switch users. Once you set that key, once again, it's disappeared there as well. So it's just a way to kind of tuck away. You also can't see the home directory of that user. Of course, if you really dig in the registry, you can find evidence that that user exists, but for the average user navigating the system, you won't notice it. The last place it vanishes is in the settings themselves. So I'm under family and other users. You can see Susan Storm. All of a sudden, they're gone. That user's still there. I can still interact with them. You can actually set that user to remove their home directory entirely. And you can still log in. There's an error that pops up, but it still seems fully functional to me. So you can do a pretty good job of hiding these users. That's our first artifact. Our second artifact is just going to barely touch on activity artifacts. So what do I mean by activity artifacts? Adversary gains access. They start doing some file system navigation, start digging around some, and maybe they start executing some applications that are native to the system. Now, this is going to cause a lot of digital footprints, I guess is the best way to put that. And if you are, if you spend any time in the forensics world, you know that every click you're making, everything that you're doing in the Windows environment is being tracked, usually by the registry. And so we have some of our more advanced adversaries actually removing those artifacts. So that's what we're going to take a look at. The first one we're going to take a look at is typed paths. So I can go into Windows Explorer, and I can type a full path to where I want to go, and it'll take me right there. Cool thing you can do is you can actually type in CMD or PowerShell, and it'll open up a command line or a PowerShell directly to that directory. And as you can see, when you go and you click that dropdown, it gives you a history of where you've been. And so there's going to be kind of a theme here with these types of artifacts. Anytime you get any convenience from Windows, they're going to have to track that somewhere. And so all those live under this Explorer typed paths. And you can see, CMD, documents, desktop downloads, full file paths. All these exist. So if you're an adversary that has RDP'd into an environment, and this is the way you choose to navigate, all this evidence is going to be there even if the system has been shut down. So of course, what do you want to do? You want to get rid of it. And so in this case, we're going to open it up. We're going to see that those exist. We're going to make this registry key change. And all of a sudden, we're going to refresh our registry. We're going to notice that they disappeared. We open up Explorer again, and all of a sudden they're gone. And so that's a great way for them to hide that activity that they've done. And this is by far not the only place where this exists. There's another place that I'm going to talk about. It's called Run MRU. MRU stands for most recently used. And so we're looking at the run command here, where you can launch applications. This also has a history. So if you've gone through and ran multiple commands, you see that Windows kindly provides that to you. They say, hey, here's a drop-down, you can run any of these again. These, of course, exist somewhere in the registry. Interesting thing about this, Microsoft doesn't keep an order necessarily of these in a way that you would expect. So they say, great, you ran CMD, we're going to assign that a letter. You ran Chrome, we're going to assign that a letter. And if you think about it, let's say you ran command first, you run a bunch of others, and then you run command again. In a traditional ordered list, you'd have to rearrange everything. All of a sudden, command would have to be, F, and everything would have to reshuffle. That's not how Run MRU actually works. They have a list down here that indicates the order that your applications ran. And so that's kind of cool. It's an efficiency mechanism that was put in place long ago, but it shows that, hey, these are the orders. Your E entry was ran, most recently followed by F, D, C, B, A. And so it keeps them from having to make too many registry changes, probably for efficiency. So let's nuke it. You can completely wipe this with a single command, and all of a sudden, we refresh that, it's gone. I opened up, I never closed run. So you'll notice that that history still exists. Whenever you close it and reopen it, it'll be empty. So there's tons of these. I could spend a whole talk on forensics artifacts of, hey, here's what a user has done, let's get rid of it. But those are two clear signs of it. And we do see this in the wild. All right, this is a fun one. This is a little peek behind the curtain in terms of how things work. So let's say you're an adversary, you've established a foothold in an environment, and you want to set up some level of persistence. A good way to do that is to use an authentic tool, a legitimate tool that's out there. So I'm going to pick on AnyDesk here for just a second, not because I think they're a bad product. They put out a great product. But adversaries are using this all the time. We see a terror agent, any of these remote access softwares are being used by adversaries. It's going to fly by AV because it's not malware. It's signed. They're usually downloading it from a legitimate source, and they're installing it on a system. And it gives them a backdoor into that system. So, of course, the question is, how do we get rid of it? Now, I'm only going to focus on one particular artifact that we can remove to actually hide that application, but I think it's an interesting one. This used to be called Add or Remove Programs. Now it's called Apps and Features in Windows 10. But we're probably all pretty familiar with this. And up until I did this research, I thought, that just gets populated by magic. I don't know how it works. I install an application, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, and I can uninstall things, right? Well, of course, registry has all the answers. When you start digging into it, I'm going to point out two specific ones here. There's display name and there's uninstall string. And so as long as display name shows up, it'll be on this list. As long as the uninstall string has something in it, this button will exist. Otherwise, it'll be grayed out. Those are the minimum two things you have to have. You'll notice also there's display icon in here. And so, of course, the part of my brain that likes to break things, makes me want to wonder, hey, what can I do with this to really mess with a user and force them to maybe uninstall their browsers? That's not where we're going with this, but there's a lot of fun to be had here. Let's just put it that way. So how do we hide something? Like, let's say maybe I've installed AnyDesk. It's actually pretty easy. We run this command. Now, you'll notice that we go to this current version uninstall subkey, and then you have to specify which app you want to kind of go after here. And so in this case, it'd be AnyDesk. I think the command I have up there is removing everything, but the command I run here just removes that display name. So as long as you remove display name, it's no longer going to be there. I'm going to go ahead and remove it, refresh my registry. You'll notice that disappears. Click off of apps and features, click back on, and it's gone. That's just a good way to hide that element and hide those tracks. Once again, you've kind of saw all those pieces. You can change the icon, you can change the string that's executed once you click on install. There's all kinds of fun stuff you can do in there. All right, we're shifting gears a little bit. We've been covering our tracks. Now I want to focus on impairing defenses. So the first one is going to really talk about how we can almost bypass a certain defense that's in place. And then we're going to get a little bit more fun with it and touch on what I call the disrespectful registry keys. So let's get started. A little bit of history here. Now keep in mind, I'm not a great historian. I wasn't, I was 13 when Windows XP came out, so it's a lot of secondhand knowledge here. So WDigest was introduced alongside Windows XP. I'm not going to get into how this authentication actually works, but the key piece is that when you would log into Windows, once again being super helpful, said, hey, you might want to use WDigest to authenticate against something. Authenticate against LDAP or HTTP. When you log in, we're going to go ahead and take your password, and we're just going to set it here in the registry. Or I'm sorry, into memory. And if you ever want to use it, we got you. It's just sitting there, right? So Mimikatz comes along, and all of a sudden you can dump that directly out. And so it was still present in Windows 7. And by the time Windows 8.1 came around, Windows wisened up and said, all right, I'm going to put out some advisories. You need to go change this registry key, which of course is just a bunch of manual work. But also when 8.1 came out, everything moving forward would have that key disabled. It would be set to 0 instead of 1. By the time we get to Windows 10, that registry key doesn't even exist. I'm taking you down this path, not because it was fixed there. You probably know that, right? So let's take a look at how to abuse that now. We'll skip over this, but I think the only interesting thing about this is in all the other ones that we've looked at, the adversary does an action and then covers it up with registry. In this case, we're flipping that. We're saying we want to set this to log the credentials to clear text in memory. And here's the interesting piece about this. Whenever you flip that switch, it doesn't take credentials that are of users that are already logged in. A user has to log in again for those credentials to be available in memory. So it tells us a little bit about the adversary. They're probably pretty patient. They're probably not doing a smash and grab job. Maybe they're going to hang out for a bit. So this tells us a little bit about them. But once a user does come along and log in, they can dump those credentials. So all we have to do is add this key back in. This was the one that was excluded from Windows 8.1 and non-existent in Windows 10. We add that back in with this use logon credential value set to 1, and it works just like it did back in 2003. And so that tells us a little bit about the Windows operating system and the technological debt it has to carry to be reverse compatible, right, or backwards compatible. So we set that, all of a sudden a user logs in, no longer is the password null, it's in clear text. So this is one that's still being used today because it still works. There's an interesting thing that I noticed in my registry key research is that there are a ton of registry keys that applications in the system are calling that don't exist. Now, why don't they exist? Maybe it's a feature that an older version used, and they don't expect it to be there, or they've removed it to quote unquote secure things. Truth is, a lot of these applications and systems are still looking for those keys. If you were to put them back in, something is trying to do something with those values. And so this is an example of that. All right. Moving on to a little bit more fun one, in my opinion. This is not taking a look at how to disable these security functionalities. This is how to hide them. So there's a key under Policies and Explorer for Settings Page Visibility, is what it's called, and you set the value to hide Windows Defender. Really, by the way, absolutely no rhyme or reason to the naming convention of these. How you disable one thing compared to what I would consider to be an equal thing may live in completely different areas. So whenever you go to settings normally, you see this nice little Windows security over here. And this is usually pointing at Windows Defender. I think you can point it to different AVs. But we set that key and all of a sudden it's no longer there. Now, is this going to allow you to bypass Windows Defender? No, that's not what I'm here to talk about. But it does make it harder for an average user to go pull that up to go check an alert, to go make sure their firewall is enabled. It's just one additional piece that's a little bit harder to do. Where else can they get to Defender, though? Well, they can right-click on a folder, and they can say Scan with Windows Defender. Of course, there's a key for that. You can disable anything in these context menus, by the way. So you know when you install like 7-zip or WinRAR, you get additional options. Those all exist under the ShellX context menu handlers. Now, the specific one I'm targeting here is EPP, Endpoint Protection. So this specific one disables it for folders. Disabling it for individual files is a little bit more difficult. You have to do that at each type of file. So there's one for EXE, one for PDF, one for XLS, because, of course, the context of what you can do with those files changes depending on the type. So I grabbed the easiest one I could just for a demo purpose, and you can actually remove that scan with Windows Defender. Once again, not bypassing anything, but making the Defender's job a little bit harder, especially for an average user. If they find something suspicious, it just makes it a little bit harder for them to do a little bit deeper dive investigation. This one is fun. This is continuing that trend of hiding security. For you that are eagle-eyed out in the audience, you'll notice this is not Windows 10. I believe this is Windows 7. And I saw this registry key in an intrusion in the last 2 years. And so I do some research on it, and I say, great, this disables the notification icon down in the bottom right. Let's slap it into Windows 10 and see if it works. Put in there, nothing. I'm getting nothing for it. It's not disappearing. I'm restarting my VM, wasting a lot of the time, to be quite honest. And so dig a little bit deeper. This hides it for Windows 7. So what does that tell me? Well, that tells me one of two things. Either one, an adversary did a lot of research about the host that they were on, found out that it was Windows 7, and they used this key. Or, which I think this is much more likely, these adversaries have outdated runbooks. And this key used to work, and nobody's updated that documentation. That'd be my guess. Once again, I have to dive into the individual intrusions to figure that out, but it does tell you a little bit about the intent there, and you can pull that back and figure out how these adversaries operate, which is definitely more on the intel side of the house, but it does provide valuable intel. So I dug a little bit deeper. I said, well, I still want to disable it for Windows 10. And so I figured out how to do that. It's under Microsoft Windows Defender Security Center under systray. You can just say hide systray to 1, and all of a sudden, what used to be a nice little shield is gone. Again, these are more fun ones to get rid of things, but we are not targeting your IR team with this one, right? Adversaries aren't saying, man, I'm gonna bypass everything. Your IR team is gonna come in, they're not gonna know what to do. Especially for larger organizations, they probably have remote ways to interact with this, and they're probably siphoning these logs off to a SIM. But this will bypass most of your average user's ability to do any investigation on this stuff. So we're kind of making a shift here. We're shifting away from hiding things, and this is a little bit more disrespectful, these last three, and they're kind of my favorites. So the first one is we're going to disable Task Manager, because of course you can, right? Why could you not? So I just launched Task Manager over there. I'm going to change this key from a 0 to a 1, and all of a sudden, let's see, I think I grabbed that. I don't know if you can read in the back there. It says Task Manager has been disabled by your administrator. So fun thing about that, if a standard user sees that, they're going to say, my admin did this. They got me, they trust me. They don't reach out to me when I click on bad things. They know what's right. And so that's the trend with shutting these things off of the registry, is that you're going to see messages that pop up that say, oh, my admin disabled this. So I think that's kind of inadvertently a way to make it seem more legitimate. We can also disable CMD. So that's not an important one, right? You won't need that. One thing to notice here is that this is HKCU. Now, if you think all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, there was HKey current user. And so what this does is it disables it for the current user, but doesn't disable it for the admin or any other users. And so as an adversary, maybe you disable it for the average user, but you leave it open for that Susan Storm, and you can still interact with the system. Now, to be fair, I was actually having a conversation with Brandon yesterday. Apparently, some military branches do this by default to their systems. So I think that's probably a pretty good call. Your average user doesn't need CMD. Your average soldier probably doesn't need CMD, right? They're not going to do any good with it. If anything, they're just bypassing controls to play video games, right? That's the best case scenario. And so we have seen this used in the wild, though. And last but not least for these, pardon the pun, this is a good way to break the key off from the door. You can disable registry tools on your way out. And so once again, we're getting messages that say, hey, your administrator has disabled this. You can no longer use reg.exe. You can no longer use regedit. Now, I'm naturally a little bit curious, and I tried out PowerShell. PowerShell still works. So we're still good. We can still revert that. It does make creating demos more difficult. If all of your bat files are using command and you disable command early in building a slide deck, I don't know about registry keys, it makes it a little bit more difficult. You got to do a little bit more research. And just to show that I don't always know what I'm doing, I completely disabled all applications for my VM and had to go back to a snapshot. So you can absolutely put yourself into a corner with some of these, but we've seen all these in the wild. So what do we do about it? Well, first we need to reevaluate what we've looked at today. On the artifact removal side, we've hid users, we've cleared some forensics pieces, and we've hidden uninstall options. And so those are all viable ways to hide those artifacts and make that activity a little bit less noticeable. We then went over and we impeded some defenses, right? We enabled wdigest clear text password storage or caching, I think is what they call it. We've hid some security options and we've disabled some admin tools. So all in all, not a bad day. What do we as defenders do about this? I am going to say here for a second, I'm gonna go to this next slide. This piece of advice is going to be extremely difficult to implement. Please don't crucify me. This is like when I hear recommendations like, just don't let them get admin, right? Like it's easier said than done. So I just want to say I'm aware of that. But if you go into an existing environment, let's say you're not actually grabbing registry key changes, you're not monitoring command lines, you're going into an environment that you've never seen before, or maybe you're just maturing your security program, it's pretty manual. If you start monitoring registry key changes from today moving forward, you won't see one that changed last week. And so hopefully, by documenting these and making them available, there's some that you can start to query. In my opinion, the wdigest one would be the place where I'd start. I'd want to know if that's enabled anywhere on accident or maliciously, right? Now, how do we do this? Well, we can use an EDR. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit biased. I think CrowdStrike does a pretty good job, but EDR in general can usually push commands out to a system. We have some OS forensics tools or interrogation tools, such as OS Query, that do a pretty good job of this as well. Or you can just build a custom script and push it out across all of your agents and pull that back. So once again, I'm fully aware, just like go check under all the rocks is not a good solution. This is the right way to do it. It doesn't make it easy. Luckily, the rest of mine are going to be a little bit easier to implement. So for ongoing monitoring, let's say you've gone through and you feel pretty confident that, hey, you know, I've checked under 2 or 3 big boulders. I don't see anything, but I would like to keep an eye out moving forward. First of all, I'd take a look for those manual changes that I talked about. You can't go in and audit or inspect every single registry key change. That'd be a whole SOC's worth of their headcount, right? They'd be looking at every single one, and trust me, it changes a lot. They'd be wasting a lot of their time. What I'm talking about here is more focused on how I change them in this talk. Reg.exe, PowerShell, or regedit. If anyone is changing registry keys manually, you should be knowing about it. That should be something you pull in. Now, that's easier said than done. How do we get that data? Of course, I'm going to recommend EDR. I think it does a pretty good job of that. But also, you can do some logging through your CMD or through PowerShell, pull those into a SIM and start to analyze those. Set up filters looking for reg add, reg delete, reg query, any of those. Look for that reg edit and dig a little bit deeper. And so I don't recommend setting this up and then immediately sending it to your SOC. There's a little bit of a tiering that we need to do. First, we need to capture all those manual changes. Do this over a period of time, maybe a week, maybe a month, depends on how busy your organization is. One thing that's going to become super apparent to you really quickly as you analyze this is if Jim, the admin that's been here for 40 years, set up a script that makes the manual registry change every morning across all the machines, you're gonna see that immediately. You're also gonna notice any custom applications that do these manual registry changes. So keep an eye on those, kind of take note of those, and then as you go into the monitoring stage, whitelist those from your alerts. And so hopefully you get the large chunk of those manual registry changes that are either legitimate or you can run down where they're coming from, and only focus on the one-offs. And so the nice thing about that monitoring phase is once you're looking at them on a daily basis as they occur, you'll absolutely know when an admin puts in another script to go manually change a key somewhere. And the last one is telemetry capture. This is part of the ongoing monitoring. Now, this is not something I would be sending every single one to a SOC. This is, once again, they happen all the time. Literally every time you open a document, it's being added to multiple places in terms of the evidence of execution and the files that were used, those MRUs, most recently used keys, constantly being updated. Even if a Windows system is sitting by itself, there's probably still some registry keys being modified. So don't look at all of them, but capture them all. This is a crucial piece of the investigation that I do as well as our threat hunters do at CrowdStrike. We grab that telemetry, and so if we find something sketchy, we can look at the telemetry around it, including those registry key changes. So if we see a reg edit where the GUI popped up, we have the telemetry to go see what keys were changed, even if it's not in a command line. And then as you mature more, and as you get more data, and as you have more researchers, maybe you hire some detection engineers, you can start setting up rules for commonly abused keys. So now you don't care if it's changed by an API, if it's changed by reg.exe, you just know when this key changes, it's bad. And so this is definitely that final step of maturity where you start capturing these and specifically building some rules for them. A lot of EDRs do a really good job of that out of the box. Once again, I'm a little biased, but all of them have this capability. And so with that said, first of all, I want to say I've got reference material down here. It's not pretty. I put that together last night. So it's just a list of the registry keys that I talked about in this talk. Eventually, I'd like to get the slides up there as well. But there's where the reference material is for anyone who wants to jot that down. Are there any questions for me? It looks like I finished a little bit early, so we've got some time. Go for it. One more time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, but I guess the way to do that, I'm thinking through it live here. I would probably open up Procmon. I would start looking for registry key queries, and I would run CMD. I know I'm going to see a query for this. It's going to check this one, and it's going to determine that it's disabled because it's set to 1. So I know it's querying that. And then when that pop-up happens immediately after, you'd have to see if there's a second query in there to check for a notification pop-up. It's a great question, though. I don't know. And I don't want to say that I've gone through every registry key change we have, but I've gone through a bunch of them, and I haven't come across that. That doesn't mean that key doesn't exist. It just means it's not actively being used. That's a good question. You had one?
Out of date. Oh, sorry. You mentioned how their playbook kind of went out of date when they were looking through different commands to run. Have you seen or know of any other, maybe, I'm assuming like a GitHub list or something like that, of other useful offensive like registry changes that, again, happen in the wild or most often to kind of evade things, turn AV off, stuff like that?
So, because I don't inherently have an encyclopedic knowledge of the registry key, so I did a lot of this research. I said, I found this key, it's being used. What the heck is it for? Sometimes Microsoft would help, sometimes they wouldn't. And I didn't find a concise list. I've started to build a list on my personal site, but doesn't seem to be one out there that I've come across. If anyone has one, I'll absolutely take it. Because right now it's very painful, and I've got references to a ton of different sites. There's a website called Pen Testing Labs or something like that that keeps coming up. Maybe not exactly that, but I'll look it up, I'll get it to you, that have a lot of really good write-ups, especially on a lot of the older registry keys, but it's not a concise list. So you're still kind of hitting individual blogs here and there. That's a good question, though. Fun fact about outdated runbooks, what we do see is incorrectly used runbooks a lot of the time. We'll see an adversary gain access to a Linux machine and run dir, or the other way around, right? We'll see somebody think that they're inside of a Metasploit shell, and they'll start running Metasploit commands when they're in CMD. And so we see this evidence of like, hey, this is my run book, this is what I'm supposed to do, and maybe they missed a step. Maybe they're somewhere they're not familiar with, or heck, I'll be the first to admit it. I run LS and CMD all the time, right? And so it really shows there's a human on the other side of this. And in cases like this, these humans may be not as skilled, especially on the eCrime side. They got run books, they're hiring people, they've got ridiculous turnover. And so if that documentation is up to date, yeah, they can look really advanced, but a lot of the time they're just copying and pasting commands, right? They're looking to hire low-skilled people to make as much money as they can. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. One more question. You mentioned how the two kind of areas that you're looking at least that you showed earlier, were the HQ current user and HQ local machine. There's like 3 or 4 other ones: classes, root, users, current config. Do you ever see those being modified, or what are those for? I guess I'm not an expert on the registry. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll be the first to admit I'm not either. I just play one on stage. But what we're seeing here, so this local machine hive, so to speak, you'll notice an error comes down here, and current config sits down here. So if you open up current config, remember this is all logical. This has nothing to do with where the files live. And so if you were to open up HKey current config and you were to open up local machine and you navigate it down into local machine, there's a point where those mirror each other. So it's really just a pointer. So current config is a pointer, current user is a pointer, and classes.root is a pointer that all point back to either users or local machine. So the HKey users has all the users. Current user will literally just point to whoever actively logged in. So could you make a registry key call that targets HKey users? Yes, but you'd probably need to know what user you wanted to target, and it's just easier to go after current user. Current config, you could probably do it pretty easily as well. You could probably create that, but remember, you're going into that hive and you're selecting a subset, a very, very small subset of local machine. And so it just makes sense to hit those top level ones because the directory is going to be the same every time. It's a great question though. As I started digging into this, I was like, why am I only seeing LM and CU, current user and local machine? This is really why. I think you got a few more minutes here. Any other questions? And I'll also be available afterwards if you have any questions. No? All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to try to skip to the end here to put up that URL again. I'll leave that up for as long as I can until the next speaker comes in. You can grab the URL and it's got a list of all the registry keys that I modified today. So, and then feel free to connect with me or reach out. Those are some other ways to get a hold of me. Thank you guys so much for attending my talk. Appreciate it.